I'm Bernie Lewis. I'm at Ernest Rutherford Retirement Village in Stoke, Nelson, New Zealand. Yes, I was the youngest of five brothers. Unfortunately, they've all predeceased me and not anyone left now. Uh, I was brought up on a dairy farm over there. Dad had about 240 acres of river flats and so on. We used to lose a few acres every now and again when there was a flood, but it was a good life. At East Takaka, we had a nice little school there. I think there were probably about 14 or 15 people there, pupils there, when I left. Uh, I didn't do very well at school initially. My mother wasn't very well, and every now and again she'd go off to hospital, and I'd be sent off to one of my brothers or to an uncle and stay there for 2 or 3 weeks. So I think that happened several times, and so I lost out a bit on education there. And then one winter I ended up with pleurisy, and I didn't get out of bed for 9 weeks. So that was another term gone. So my primary school work was a bit ho-hum, but it was a struggle for me in Nelson College. But I liked it there. I used to do a lot of shooting. I seem to remember I won most of the shooting trophies in the last 2 years. It was a good life. Used to go fishing, of course, and hunting back in the hills, Mount Arthur area. Oh, I have no regrets about my upbringing at all. It was a good life, and I had a good life in the RAF too, or with Rolls-Royce in particular. No regrets. Yes, the New Zealand Air Force, they offered me a job not as a pilot training, but as a navigator. I didn't want to be a navigator. My brother was a pilot, was a Pathfinder pilot flying Lancasters during the war, and he said that navigators are all right, but he just wouldn't like his daughter to marry one. So that didn't sound very good to me, and the RNZAF refused to alter their decision. They offered me a job again as a navigator, so I caught the next boat to England and joined the RAF, and they accepted me for pilot training. After signing up at Air Ministry in London, they were very good to me, and they said normally it'll take about 3 months for you to get a reply after this, whether you're accepted for training or not. But they gave me a ticket out to Hornchurch, where the Aircrew Selection Centre was, and they were holding briefings there or interviews there. And I went out there the very next day. They were good. And after about 3 or 4 days selection, they decided I could become a pilot, worthwhile training. So I went to the 6 months ground school and then on to flying training at Feltwell in Norfolk. And believe it or not, out of 76 entrants, I was the top candidate for the best pilot, which was a good starter, seeing as how New Zealand didn't offer me anything like that at all. So I had good training. I went on to jet fighters, the early jet fighters, and was posted off to Germany during the I was there in 1952 at the beginning of the Cold War, and we flew initially Vampire jet fighters, and after about a year we were re-equipped with the American F-86 Sabre, which was more up-to-date. It was equivalent to the Russian MiGs at the time. So I had 2.5 years in Germany on a fighter squadron, initially up in the northwest of Germany near Bremen, and then after we got the Sabres we moved south down just west of Cologne. From there I was posted to England again and was sent to the Central Flying School on an instructor's course, which lasted 6 months. First of all, there was 3 months on piston-engine aircraft, and then 3 months on Vampire jets. I was fortunate there at on the piston-engine course. I won the aerobatic trophy there, a well-known trophy, the Clarkson Trophy, and then on the Vampires I competed against their aerobatic people, and I won that trophy as well, so it was a good start. After that I was posted to the Cambridge University Air Squadron at Cambridge and had 2.5 years there as well instructing. It was a good position. It was virtually out of the Air Force. We had no parades or anything like that. We were dealing with university students all the time. But I still managed to keep up a bit of jet flying at some neighbouring aerodromes where there were fighters. From Cambridge, at the end of every year, a form used to come around asking what you wish to do in your next posting. And they never ever took any notice of where you wanted to go. But on this occasion, I'd put down the Empire Test Pilot School. And believe it or not, towards the end of my tour at Cambridge, I was asked to go down to Farnborough for an interview for the Test Pilot School, which was the oldest test pilot school in the world at the time. So I went there. It had about 3 days there, I think it was, being medically examined, psychologically examined, what have you. And a few weeks later, I was given a letter to say that I was accepted for the Empire Test Pilot School to start the following January. You had to have done an operational tour. You had to be above average or exceptional as a pilot in your rating, and you had to be not older than 30 years or something like that, I think. And of course, medically fit. As I say, they did sort of psychological testing, intelligence questions. Yeah, it was a good 3-day investigation. There were 13 aircraft, I think, available for us to fly, all different kinds. A lot, of course, we hadn't flown before, but we were given 3 aircraft a week to fly, and we've given pilot's notes to read up about them. And so you did your conversion that way. On the latest fighters, which I hadn't flown before, we were sort of given a day to read up about it and get to know it. the Canberra bomber, which was in force at the time, that generally took about 3 months in the Air Force to do your conversion. At Farnborough, at their test pilot school, I read the pilot's notes beforehand. One afternoon I was given dual in the aircraft by one of the instructors, and then I was sent off solo with one of the flight engineers to help me start the engine and get to know the aircraft. I think I did an hour's solo the next day, and about 3 weeks later I was told to go away in the Canberra and investigate the handling of the very high Mach numbers, which I was also given an engineer with me to help me with the engines and so on, in case we had any problems. So straight away, after about 3 hours flying, I was sent to investigate the high-speed handling at high Mach numbers at high altitude. And there I had to go up to beyond 50,000 feet and then dive the aircraft at full power down to about 40,000 feet and report on the handling. And towards the end, when we're getting near its limiting Mach number, the controls became very, very finicky. They would twitch, and the aircraft was shuddering and juddering, and it was difficult to read the instruments panels. It was getting pretty rough flight. And I was climbing back up again to 52,000 feet. And I said to my flight engineer, who hadn't said a word during all this, I said, all right, Fred, I said, just one more dive and that'll be okay. And I noticed he was had a copy of the pilot's notes in his hand. And he was reading them. I thought, he's very calm and collected. And I happened to look down at him as he was sitting beside me, and I saw what he was reading. He had it open at the rear page entitled Emergency, Abandoning the Aircraft in Flight. I'll never forget him for that. He was very good. So that was my introduction into the Canberra. I flew it later on at lower levels, doing high-speed investigation and stability things and so on. I was never very good at mathematics at college or anything like that. And during the first term, we had 3 terms for the year. During the first term, I had an assistant technical officer there keeping an eye on me, and he wanted to learn to fly. And we had chipmunks there, which I had been flying at the Canberra University Air Squadron. And so in the evenings, I used to be able to get hold of a chipmunk and I'd give him some dual instruction. And he would help me with all my mathematical problems dealing with the aircraft I'd flown. He was a great assistance to me. At the end of the term, he was posted away, and I was sort of crikey. How am I ever going to get through this course? And we were asked, they wanted 3 volunteers for helicopters at the next station where we're going to be posted. So I thought, oh crikey, that'll make things a little bit easier for me if I've got to convert onto helicopters as well. So I put my hand up and I was accepted for helicopter conversion and training. I thought it would make it much easier on the fixed wing side, but it didn't really, because we had the convert onto helicopters and we were still given the fixed wing test to do as well. So it was a very busy year, but I managed. And at the end of the year, I had 34 hours, 40 minutes flying helicopters, and I was sent to Boscombe Down on the helicopter test squadron there to test helicopters. Well, nowadays it takes you at least 50 hours to become a helicopter pilot for a private pilot's license. There I was at 34 hours 40, and I was testing helicopters which I'd never seen before. 6 months later, I was out in Aden doing tropical trials on a little tiny helicopter that the Army were using at the time. 18 months after that, I was in Canada doing rotor de-icing on a big naval helicopter. So it was quite a variation and a very steep learning curve. I did 3 years there at Boscombe Down, and then I was posted to Central Flying School again as a helicopter instructor, training for one. So I did that. I qualified on the helicopter instructing side. I think I came top on the helicopter theory at last. And then one morning, when I was having coffee, I had a phone call, and the chap spoke to me. He said, "I'm Tom Frost. I'm Chief Test Pilot of Bristol Siddeley Engines." He said, "How are you liking the Air Force?" I said, "It's a bit stuffy. Yeah. All the paving stones along the paths and roads are alternately painted black and white, and people salute you if you move. I didn't really like it a lot." And he said, "Well, would you like to come and join us?" So I said, "Yes, that sounds a good idea." So a few days later, I went down to Bristol, to where Bristol Siddeley Engines were at Filton, and we had a good interview together. And a few months later, they got all the... I was worried about getting out of the Air Force, as I had been given a permanent commission. But they said, "That's no problem. We have higher ups in the Air Force." And they did. A few months later, I left the Air Force and I joined Bristol Siddeley Engines. At the end of that year, there was an election in England, and the Conservatives were in at the time, but Harold Wilson and his shoddy crowd were there screaming to get in, and they sent down their shadow Air Minister to Bristol, and they told all the people. I saw in the Bristol Evening News, "Your jobs are safe with us." And about 2 or 3 weeks later, they had the election and Labor got in. We had 8 test pilots there. We immediately were cut back to 5. I think about 17% of the whole workforce of Bristol Siddeley Engines and Bristol Aircraft Corporation on the other side of the airfield, I think they all lost about 17% of their personnel. So I wasn't very thrilled with Harold Wilson and his crowd. Anyway, it was great fun at Bristol Siddeley. Oh, following on from that election, Harold Wilson said, we're only going to have one engine company in England, and with the name of Rolls-Royce, we were left dangling, so we became Rolls-Royce. Just as a lot of the aircraft companies, de Havilland's became Hawker Siddeley and so on. There's a big amalgamation. Handley Page, they just became redundant likewise. But at Bristol, the first job I had there was to convert Bristow Helicopters, who was a big helicopter company in the world, or one of the biggest. They were at Red Hill in Surrey. I was sent to convert their pilots onto the new turbine engine helicopters, which we were making the engines for. And from there, I went out to Iran and trained their pilots out there. Coming back, I found that we had not only helicopters to look after. I was given some of the smaller training aircraft used in the RAF that used our engines. I did a lot of flying on them. Aircraft such as the Strike Master, which we had out here, and the Italian Macchi and so on, they all used the same engines which we had. The Germans at the time, they were using an Italian aircraft, the Fiat G91, that used our engines. And it was a very similar aircraft to the Sabre. And so I managed to get on that, and I went to Germany. I did an afternoon's conversion on that aircraft, and then I was posted from there up to Husum, a German Air Force station north of Hamburg. We had an aircraft up there fitted out specifically for the engine problems which the Germans had. So I used to fly around up there at various heights, speeds and so on, and to get recordings for the engine problem they had. The problems were that on each side of the intake of the aircraft, they had 30mm cannons, and when they fired, all the smoke and explosive mixtures would get sucked straight back into the engine and could cause problems. That was their problem there. The Germans, they were exceptionally good people to work with. Every morning we'd have a briefing there. It was in perfect English, covered all the Met forecasts and everything, and they were absolutely excellent. During the week, the Commandant called me in, and he said, "Mr. Lewis, we thank you very much indeed for being over here, helping us. And as you know, we opened the airfield at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and we close at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon," which was exactly precise. But he said, "Because you are here helping us, we will keep the airfield open all weekend for you." Now that meant they had to bring in medical people, they had to bring in ambulance, they had to have engineering, refueling people, air traffic control, security, everything. It was a big effort for them. But he said, for you, it is there, but please on Sunday, will you not fly low over the churches? That was his one stipulation. I had a terrible fright flying these Fiats. They were very much like the Sabre, as I said. And on the wings, they had the German markings, a big black cross. I'd be flying along there, or prior to the World War, I used to read every book I could about aviation. There always seemed to be Biggles fighting aircraft with big black crosses. There was Rockfist Rogan we used to get. He was always fighting aircraft with big black crosses. My brother was over there during the war. He was against big black crosses. And I'd be flying around northern Germany there, minding my own business, taking notes. Every now and again I'd look out. There was a bloody big black cross about 10 feet away from me. And always gave me a terrible shock. I thought I was going to be vaporized any moment. How did he get in there so close to me without me seeing him? And all the time it was me and that black cross flying. That went on for days. It was a terrible shock. Suddenly look out and see the enemy, as it were. But in actual fact, they were not the enemy. They were very good people to work with. The Iraqis also had problems with our engines. It was a helicopter. So I went out there. I flew with them and helped them out too. And likewise with the Austrian Air Force. They had helicopters with our engines. It was a great life with Rolls-Royce. Joining an airframe company, you only flew the aircraft belonging to that company. But on Rolls-Royce, on Bristol, Siddeley, whatever, we made engines for all sorts of aircraft. And as such, we got a good variety of flying in. We had our own executive jets, the Hawker Siddeley 125, which was a twin jet. The aircraft was held about 8 or 10 people. We had various upgrades of engines, of our engines in that. So we got a good variety of that flying too. We had another aircraft, Handley Page. In their last desperate throes, they made an aircraft called the Jetstream. And we ended up with the very third prototype, which the third prototypes of any aircraft company usually ended up on engine development. And so we had the third prototype of the Jetstream. There are 3 flying down here at Nelson Airport. And again, that was it flew very well, but it had some peculiarities, and it always kept me very alert. I won't go into the instrumentation. It was all rubbish. It was bits and pieces from all sorts of aircraft. But the aircraft itself, as I say, it flew excellently. But on about my second takeoff with it, no sooner had I raised the nose and I was just reaching for the undercarriage lever and one engine stopped. The most critical time you could ever wish to have an engine stop. At low speed, one engine at full power and nothing on the other. And believe it or not, that happened probably about 6 or 7 times at that crucial moment. It always kept you very alert. One day it was decided we'd take it back to Pau, which is in the southwest of France, to the engine makers over there. It was a French turbomaker engine, but Rolls-Royce were given the work to do on it, so that's how we were flying in the Handley Page Jetstream. So I went to take it down to Pau one afternoon and didn't even get off the runway before the engine failed. So I came back, we had to clear customs again, and then they fixed it all up. It was only a matter of a little pipeline which would break every now and again. And off we went again. Got up to about 300 feet this time, and the engine failed again. So I said to my navigator, I said, well, the most dangerous thing in this aircraft is taking off. Let's start it. We started it up, and we flew down to Pau. And we got there just as it was getting dark. And the French, in their usual way, they weren't like the Germans at all. I was lined up nicely on the final approach, and the French allowed one of their troop-carrying aircraft to come in ahead of me and land. So I had to overshoot and go around again and come in. It was a very interesting afternoon's flight, that. So we had one of our 125 aircraft waiting there to pick me up, and we flew back to Filton. Fortunately, they had a courtesy bar on board, and we really got stuck in, the navigator and I. It was one good thing about those executive aircraft. They were well stocked. Another problem I had, you're talking about incidents. We had a scout helicopter there, British Army helicopter, which we're developing the engine on. And we did a lot of flying on it. And I was taxiing out one morning, and I could hear one of our 125s about 15 miles away. They were positioning to come in and land. Now I knew, as I taxied out, I looked down the runway and there's an enormous cloud of starlings just landed in the grass. And I knew that birds and jet engines, they don't go. They cause all sorts of problems, usually ending up with an engine shutting down or blowing up, literally. And so I could hear this 125 coming in with its passengers, and I saw all these birds down the runway. So I flew down towards them, not hurriedly or anything, I just wanted to scare them away. And they all got up and flew over and landed on the other side of the runway. Well, that irritated me a little bit. So I increased speed, I climbed up, and I came back diving at them. This time I had the wind behind me. And I dived at this crowd of starlings. There were thousands of them there. And I thought, I'll pull up just before I get there, and they'll disperse. But I pulled up, and I think with the tailwind and the extra speed, I pulled up in amongst them. There was starlings everywhere. They were scratching the windscreen as they came down with their claws. I could pretty well hear them. And I could see there were going to be about 700 or 800 going into the engine, taking that out. There'd be another 200 or 300 taking up the tail rotor as well. That would make a great imbalance down there, probably tear out the tail rotor gearbox. And I would suddenly be very nose heavy, and I'd strike the middle of the runway and burst into flames. At that stage, I think I lost control a little bit, and I said, "Oh shit!" Thousands of starlings did that. The rotor sucked it all down. All the effluent came down all over the cabin. I couldn't see out. I was absolutely blacked out. I tried the windscreen wipers. They just messed it up and just spread it around a bit more. Fortunately, there was a clear vision panel just down beside me, and I flicked that open, and I saw the ground about 100 feet down below me, and I was very, very wobbly hover. And I looked down at my flight test engineer. He was flopped back in his seat. He was absolutely pale, and he had two black eyes looking at me. And he said, "Shit." I said, "Yes, let's go back." So we sort of crabbed sideways back to dispersal, where they put a high pressure hose over the whole aircraft. Do you know, there wasn't a trace of a feather or a bone of any of those starlings, and there were thousands of them there. They were just sucked down. We didn't appear to touch one. Absolutely amazing. One of the other engines I flew was the Concorde engine, the Olympus 593. That was going to be used for Concorde. We flew that engine, probably about 3 or 4 years before Concorde ever flew. So it was a very well tested engine before Concorde got airborne. We used to take that up to 50,000 feet quite regularly. And big picture of it up there, with the engine right behind the nose wheel. We didn't dare taxi or take off or land with the undercarriage in the down position because it would flick up stones which would be ingested into the engine and damage it. So we always had a big barn door came down across the intake. And so we never ever used the Concorde engine for takeoff. We'd get up to at least 150 feet, 150 knots, and about 1,000 feet before we ever started the engine. And then we'd take it up to all sorts of heights, and maximum height was 50,000 feet, and to a Mach number of 0.98, just below the speed of sound, which in the Vulcan at the time was probably nearer, with position errors and so on, was probably nearer about 0.94. Other engines we had, again in the Scout helicopter. We'd sold some out to Kenya, I think it was, and they were having trouble starting the engine at 10,000 feet. Helicopters really operate low level, and they don't go much beyond about 10,000 feet normally, normally operations. And one of our requirements is if you're going to start an engine altitude, you must leave it, after you've shut it down, you must leave it for 2 minutes to cool down and so on, and then do your start. So these people out in Nairobi, what's the mountain out there?
Kilimanjaro.
Yes, that's it. They were having trouble starting. So at 10,000 feet, we decided we'd better go up to 20,000 feet and shut down an engine and give it a sort of 2 minutes. Shut down and then start at 10,000 feet. In actual fact, by the time you started at 10,000 feet, you'd be down to about 8,000. So you had to do it all over again. And I'd start to try the start at about 12,000 feet. But it was great to be up there, 20,000 feet. I remember a London British Airways aircraft passing underneath. I thought he'd be pretty surprised if he looked up and saw a helicopter 5,000 feet above him. We did a lot of relighting on our craft. Again, I was involved with the Marquis and the Strike Master, which had the Viper engine. And we used to do relighting up to about 35,000 feet was the maximum. You'd have to, as I say, shut the engine down. You'd glide for 2 minutes before you could start. So you'd go up to about 38,000 feet and shut the engine down and then glide, aiming to be at your test altitude at 35,000 feet. Either the critical times were 120 knots, or where you could get a light going, was the easiest then. You couldn't do it at high speed because anything over a few hundred knots, the airflow through the engine would prevent a light up. So you're more or less restricted to the lower speed engine end. So I spent a lot of time gliding from there, because every now and again you wouldn't get it start up, so you would have to descend to a lower altitude and try it there.
You returned to New Zealand and worked for CAA.
That's correct, yes. I was with them for about 7 years, and I was a general aviation inspector at the start, dealing mainly with the helicopter side. They were having a lot of accidents out here at the time, particularly in the deer wars, as it were, and we helped to calm those things down a little bit. I did a little bit of flight testing here with Pacific Aerospace and their new aircraft, the Cresco. I did the spinning trials on that. But after about 7 years, I was offered a job to fly for Fay Richwhite in their beautiful helicopter which they had brought out from the States. It was a magnificent machine, and I flew around quite a lot around the country after that, and I was asked would I like to fly, would I be available, and would I like to fly the Duke of Edinburgh around down south to Stewart Island, around Fiordland, and so on like that. So I did that. I think when he came out here for the Commonwealth Games, I think it was in 91. After that, I stayed on I became more or less a consultant, but I did other work for civil aviation as well, doing flight tests. I was pretty dedicated on flying. I remember when Arthur Clouston came out here in his aircraft in about 1934. He flew down the Tarkika Valley. He comes from Collingwood, you see. So he flew down the Tarkika Valley. And I remember going out there and watching him come down in it was old Percival de Havilland Comet. And it was strange to see that in about 20 or 30 years' time, he was my boss in England. He was the commandant of the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and I served under him. It was just strange, sort of putting the two back together again. Yes, he used to do a little bit of work for my grandfather in Collingwood. My grandfather was a surveyor there, and old Arthur Clouston used to help him out at times. And Arthur told me that he always liked my grandmother's Christmas pudding. Thought it was very good. He wanted me to stay on in the Air Force. He said I was wrong joining Rolls-Royce. We should have carried on. He became an Air Commodore. That's when I met up with him. I had three brothers who joined the Air Force. One of them went to England and became a Pathfinder pilot. Another one went to Canada and trained on got his wings there, but the war ended. And the other one, who was the oldest brother, he had only been in for about 6 months when he had his gallbladder removed. So they said that he was unfit for any service. I had my gallbladder removed in England. I was at the test pilot school a year later. Yep, I was married in England. I just happened to be in London one night, and I met up with some Canadians. And they took me along to a place called they took me along to some club which had been used by the Canadians during the war, Canadian pilots. And there were two of them and myself, and the place was quite empty. And in walked a couple of young ladies in British European Airways uniform. They both looked very smart. One looked a bit smarter than the other. And I decided that looks very likely young lady for me. So that's where I met up with her in London at not a nightclub. It was a club, but it was not the usual rubbishy old nightclub you met up with. It was a bit like the Kimmel Club, which a lot of the RAF and New Zealand fighter pilots inhabited. Decima, D-E-C-I-M-A, Decima Norris.
And was she...
She was in uniform. She was in town. There was a film being shown, Holiday to Paris, I think it was called. And the people at Leicester Square who were showing the film asked British European Airways if they could have a couple of their employees to help out with the advertising. and we caught her at the end of the advertising. That
Roughly.
was in 1952. We were married in 1953. In Germany, we had a couple of moves back to England with the Central Flying School, and a move there, and then to University Air Squadron, back down to Farnborough. We did a lot of moves.
And family?
Family, I have a daughter who's in her late 60s now, and a son who's 61. They are both in Auckland. Daughter's working on computers, doing hospital work. It keeps her very busy. My son had a business on dealing with computers and advertising, and he's taken early retirement. He's now working as a volunteer for St John and a volunteer SAR operator.
So you've got grandchildren?
I've got grandchildren, I've got great-grandchildren,
Right.
yes.